The purpose of this webinar is to let you meet our authors, and let's talk about some big ideas in education. So the two folks that I have invited have written 3 books for us, and let me highlight those 3 books for you. So we've got inquiry-based lessons in history, and we've done 3 of them. So there's U.S. history, and then there's World History Volume 1 and World History Volume 2. The emphasis here is on inquiry. It's also on primary sources integrated into the lessons you're doing. And a lot of the primary sources that are used are diverse and interesting. I think I'm listing them on that bullet list there. And we're integrating literacy skills into the lessons that we're doing. These books are all available at proofrock.com. They are also available from social studies school services. They're available from Amazon, barnesandnoble.com. But of course, I would encourage you to go to the Proofrock website and buy them from us, but you are welcome to go elsewhere as well. So let me introduce first Jenna Kirchner, PhD. She's 30 years in education, experience as a school district instructional supervisor, assistant professor at Western Kentucky University, a social studies consultant, actively out in the field now, and a past classroom teacher. She's also one of the authors of Parenting Gifted Children 101, which is one of our Proofrock books. And so thank you, Jenna. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We are glad you're here with us today.
Absolutely, absolutely. And our second author is Dr. Andrew McMichael. He is the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and a professor of history at Auburn University at Montgomery. He is he earned his PhD from Vanderbilt, and prior to that, he was a high school teacher, and he's got a lot of experience teaching in kindergarten, 3rd, and 5th grade classrooms. One of the reasons these two folks have Dr. McMichael, thank you for being here.
That's okay. Good to see everybody, or to sort of see everybody.
Oh, I should mention, for those of you not initiated in Zoom, we can't see you, but you can see us. So that's the half that he's referring to. You can see us. One of the reasons that these books are so interesting is that they were developed, part of the development work was done as part of 2 U.S. Department of Education Teaching American History grants that were spanned over a 10-year period. So you're getting a lot of fantastic lessons. Inquiry, and even in gifted education, but in general education too, inquiry is one of those topics that we often talk about in different disciplines, but it may be a little bit different in history. And Jenna, can you talk a little bit about what inquiry looks like when we're doing it in the history classroom?
Sure. Joel, let me show you just a little bit of an introduction using a PowerPoint. We won't do that the whole time, but we wanted to kind of give you some context for where inquiry is in social studies, and this also applies in the gifted field as well. So let me take a second and pull up the PowerPoint. There we go. Can everybody see that? And just give you a little bit of context with where inquiry is in the country right now, and ground what we're going to talk about for the rest of the webinar. So first off, let me kind of set the stage for nationally. The definition in social studies of inquiry comes from this sort of a landmark document from 2013 that's called the College Career and Civic Life Framework. And since that time, this is a national document that sets up what is called an inquiry arc in social studies. So if you notice those dimensions, and you'll see the sorts there on the bottom if you're interested in exploring that, those dimensions are 4 different parts, and they set the stage and develop the background for what all the states are developing now as state standards. So an inquiry cycle using the C3 framework as the lens starts with questions and inquiries, and students would explore those answers to those questions using disciplinary tools and concepts. So your content domains of civics, economics, geography, and history. Dimension 3 then has them evaluate sources and use evidence to develop a claim. So the key to that is understanding that they're examining sources, a variety of sources that we'll talk about throughout the webinar, to help them answer that question or help them to explore that that inquiry. And so then dimension 4 has them communicating conclusions, because we want them to be able to write or discuss, take a position that answers that question, or make an argument. And then kind of what I always call our end game of social studies is we want to graduate coming through our school system, students who are capable of having jobs, being effective citizens, all the responsibilities that that involves, and taking informed action in their communities. So that's dimension 4 there. So nationally then, social studies has tried to grapple with what do we mean by inquiry? How do we develop lessons and units aligned to the inquiry questions? And the language from that document is compelling and supporting questions. So compelling question might be a big overarching question that would guide 2 or 3 weeks worth of instruction, but we know you have to scaffold the learning for all students. So then supporting questions are smaller, maybe 1 or 2 day lesson type of questions that would build that learning towards the compelling questions. So in our books, we use things that are more at the supporting question level. That could be 1 or 2 day types of lessons that you could use to supplement whatever curriculum or state standards you have. So know that nationally, states are kind of trying to figure out what do our state social studies standards look like, teaching around these inquiry cycle and questions. So if we look at that, and we take that a step further, Dr. McMichael and I have sort of developed this 1, 2, 3, 4 step of, so how do you go about doing that? What makes sense as far as, okay, I like the idea of that. How do I develop that into lessons or units? So it could be a 1 day lesson, it could be a 2-week unit. And these are our 1, 2, 3, 4 steps that make sense to us to kind of manage that planning. And they start with, you have to start with a question. So number 1 is always a question. It could be a teacher-generated question that students explore, or it could be a series of student-generated questions that maybe you give them a prompt or a visual or a political cartoon or some sort of real-world problem. COVID-19 would be a great one right now to promote an inquiry. But you got to start with a question and then let them explore sources or examine, investigate sources. All kinds of things. If we're talking history, we're going to talk primary sources, we're going to talk maps, visuals, paintings, political cartoons. But I put number 3 here over on the side because students at all age levels don't always bring the skills with them to be able to do that. So you've got to embed those. How do we teach them to do that? By using those literacy strategies that we know are good practice in all content areas. And by teaching and modeling for them, how do you analyze a primary source? How do you understand this artifact? Or why might this newspaper article make sense as we tackle this question? So then our end goal is to get them to make a hypothesis. We actually use that word, which is kind of more of a science word, but we use it in our history books. Or you could say communicate claims. So you want students, here's the meat of it, to answer that question or to make an argument with evidence from all the sources that they investigated. So that 1, 2, 3, 4 type of step for designing lessons and units has guided our work in professional development and in writing and presenting lessons. So hopefully that's helpful and it makes you get your head around something that's sort of an abstract concept of how do we teach and develop units with inquiry as our focus. So what does that look like if we're doing inquiry in social studies like Joel asked? We're using sources as evidence. If we want to think like detectives or think like archaeologists or think like historians, we're using a variety of sources, primary sources and secondary sources to answer questions. So I put some slides in the PowerPoint just to show you an example of what that looks like, because sometimes I think, okay, I get that and I get the idea of that, but show me what that looks like in 6th grade or in my GT pull-out classroom where I'm supposed to help do some extensions with kids who are gifted in social studies or gifted in reading. So here's just an example, and I'm just going to talk through it quickly so you can see the slides. If you are interested in this PowerPoint, I'll be glad to share this. And this is a lesson from one of our world history books. So you start with a visual, and these happen to be pictures of seals from ancient India, a civilization called the Harappans. And you just start with some real simple questions. And in fact, we use this strategy a lot in our books. What do you notice and what do you wonder? You just want to prompt some thinking to develop some questions about, okay, what clues can we get about this civilization from these seals? I put some visuals in here so you could see. You can use an I notice, I wonder graphic organizer that looks like this. Or a lot of times in our books, we use one that you can put several clues around the room. And I notice I wonder clue sheet where you can adapt the organizing question based on whatever your lesson content is. And then they would examine some clues and complete what they notice. And then the other side of that, that's promoting inquiry, is what do you wonder about? What do these clues make you think about this particular question that you're grappling with? And then at the bottom, based on all these clues that you've examined, what are your hypotheses about that organizing question? What do we think? And that's what historians do a lot as they examine clues. So that's a clue sheet to help them organize their thinking. And I'm going to quickly just go through these slides to show you some clues that go in this lesson, because we intentionally pulled some artifacts or pictures of artifacts, maps, photographs, all sorts of different types of sources that students would explore. So this particular lesson used the I notice, I wonder, and it also uses a gallery walk strategy. So the clues would be posted around the room and they take their I notice, I wonder clue sheet and look at maps and more seals, pictures, ruins. Those are the ruins and artifacts from that civilization. So, and I'm doing this quickly, but so then what do you do next? So they have a clue sheet of all these I notice, I wonder content pieces that they observed and questions they wonder. So you have them work in groups and have them use their evidence to make a hypothesis that answers the question. And so I gave them, or we would give them the question. That would be a teacher generated question. But then notice also that this strategy builds in all those I wonder questions that they develop themselves. So then you would talk about what I wonder questions do we still not know answers to? And where might we go to find some answers? How would we investigate that using our videos or pictures or sources, things you would embed in your instruction anyway. And then as you examine that, have them present their hypothesis that would answer the question. And you could pick the product. I think it's even stronger if you let the students pick the product for how they want to answer the question. So it gives you and them a lot of flexibility in exploring that content question in a variety of ways. So let me turn this off, and hopefully that set the stage for you for what inquiry looks like in the world of social studies right now.
That's fantastic. That really frames it. I appreciate that. And please let me encourage you as the session goes on, as you think of questions, please type those questions in. Stephanie's taking care of them as they come in, but there are also some general stuff that we can pose to the two authors later on. So feel free to ask those bigger questions about implementation in the classroom and the like. I love this quote from your book. It was essentially one of the defining purposes of the book is that the teacher is no longer the provider of knowledge, but rather the facilitator of historical thinking. And I wanted to throw this question to Dr. McMichael. Could you, for just a sec, because in the introduction you guys kind of do this, tell me, in your view, what is it to think like a historian?
Oh, God. Well, so I think this helps answer one of the questions that popped up there about asking, is this about asking them a question and having them discover on their own? And we tossed around, I noticed when the book covers came up, we were incredibly uncreative in our book titles. They also are the same. But that's because there are books out there that use the phrase thinking like a historian, and historian as detective. And I think especially for kids, that's an important way to think about what historians do. We start with a problem. Why, and to get back to something that was said earlier about the current COVID crisis, why did the Black Plague create such havoc in Europe? Why did the bubonic plague create such havoc? That's a question, and that needs an answer. And as a detective, you would begin to gather evidence, just like in any kind of criminal case. You would say, well, here's a clue. A lot of people died. Here's another clue. It was mostly certain kinds of people, the very old and the very young, or the people who were already sick. And how did it spread? And this would lead you sort of down a path of asking more questions to solve the original question. Why did it create so much havoc? And so inquiry based and thinking like a historian is about asking them a question, but it is kind of a guided question. You ultimately are trying to get them, it's not open-ended, it's not sort of what happened during the Middle Ages. It's something very specific. So you're asking them very guided question because you want them to discover some specific knowledge. So they're not going to just sort of go off on their own. And in terms of thinking like a historian, that's pretty much what historians do when they teach, when they write books, when they write articles. You start with a basic question. Why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? Well, there are a lot of answers to that, and historians could go on forever. What were the root causes of the Civil War? Those kind of broadly specific questions, if I can say it that way, are the kinds of things that can be done by academic historians and by fifth grade students. It doesn't, the question doesn't change. This just the sort of depth of knowledge that they're going to get at the end might be different. And that's really what we've tried to do here. And that's why I like that question so much. Is it about asking them a question and having them discover? Well, yes, but it's about asking them a very specific question and having them get to a place. And in a classroom full of 25, 30 kids, they're going to get to, within a big circle of a place. And they're going to come up with some really interesting stuff if you let them kind of go on their own to answer this. And so it is about discovery. It is about detective work, ultimately.
That makes sense. In fact, that's, I mean, essentially how you guys constructed those lessons were around this idea of detective work and clues and that sort of thing. There were a couple of things that I had gone back to refresh my memory about the U.S. history book, and something you just said about, you can use it with younger kids or older kids. I looked through this thing and just thought my 6-year-old would love to do this kind of stuff, working with these, primary materials. I mean, obviously, Janet, like what you said about, that there is a level of literacy that my 6-year-old can't, go back and read a newspaper from the Revolutionary War, but the objects and things like that were something that I think these could be scaffolded in different ways for different ages. Janet, could you talk a little bit about how you guys, I know you had wanted to introduce kind of the structure of the lessons and how they help new teachers and experienced teachers in the classroom. Could you tell a little bit about that, what you had in mind there?
Yeah, sure. So what we hoped is to create a series of lessons that would work in a variety of states and places, countries even, and with brand new teachers who are just starting and looking for quality materials, or maybe even teachers who had been at it for a long time and you wanted a new strategy to try, you wanted to switch the focus. So we developed these lessons that are very almost formulaic in the sense that we wrote them that way, but you could adapt them in a variety of ways. So they all start with a question. They start with after that, what materials do they need to have? So either the excerpt of the source is provided or a link, if it's online that they could find it, we provided the link to how to find that source, any materials needed. And then we started each lesson with a little bit of a lesson hook. So how could you get the students pulled into that lesson a little bit, connecting to their lives or something that's interesting that they might want to talk about? So they have a lesson hook and then they have the question. And I will say in ours, we had to write so that it was a teacher generated question, but if you could provide a way for students to generate some of their own, that's even more powerful. And then they literally have a step-by-step outline for here's how I do this lesson. So as a teacher, if you need that structure, you need, how do I get started? This is new to me. It's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and here's how I wrap it up with the assessment. But if you've been teaching a long time, you can choose to pick and choose different sources. You can pull the strategy if you like it. You can stick that into a unit that you've already developed, but you just like this as a supplemental lesson. So we wanted to make it apply to a lot of different audiences, very much as a supplemental to whatever your state standards are, to whatever textbook series you use already. It's very adaptable. For younger learners, you can we decided to err on the side of giving most of the primary sources. So there are some teachers who will look at that and say, this is way too challenging of a text for my 5th graders or 8th graders or even 11th graders maybe sometimes. So we decided to put it in there and let you as teacher professionals decide, hey, I need to use an excerpt of this, or I need to adapt and use a different source here. So we hopefully gave you more than you needed so that you could have some choices as how you used it.
And I would build on that, and then something Joel said a few minutes ago, that some of these are lessons that I've used with my college students for years, and we just sort of changed up a little bit to make the level a little bit more accessible, or some of the documents, excuse me, are the same ones that I've used with my college students for years, especially the maps. And so Joel mentioned a 6-year-old, but honestly, a 6-year-old can take a colonial map and look at it and notice things, and will say, there's sea monsters in the ocean. There are, these things. What is that? And they've begun that process of inquiry.
Yeah, I tell you what, let me do this. I will show you guys, let me show you guys one of these lessons. So this is the one that I was looking at for the U.S. history. And one of the things you guys do such a fantastic job of is sort of giving the teacher the historical background of, a little bit of context for what the history of the that's going to be studied, so that the teacher has context of what you're going into. And then you identify the standards being addressed. Um, you've got Then you create the organizing questions, the materials you needed, all of the primary source materials. You have links to solid websites that are going to be there in the years into the future, which is sometimes a problem, we've got links in printed books. But you've got the lesson plan. There is just sort of all of the resources that the teacher needs. And I know that was generated because you guys have been working with hundreds of teachers as you had these grants. Thinking about the lessons as you were developing, what were some things that you learned as you went about the process of helping teachers implement in the classrooms? Did you learn anything challenging or interesting about what was happening with the history education in the classrooms?
Well, I don't, something that we noticed, I don't know that we learned, but that we noticed was that teachers know how to teach. It's just where to find the sources and where to freshen things up. So we worked with, as you said, a lot of teachers, and they were all great teachers. We weren't teaching them how to be teachers. What we were doing was exposing them to new sources and methods that they could pick and choose from. And so the idea wasn't to come out of this seminar or out of this book and do everything exactly as we say because you didn't know what you were doing. It was, you're already a good teacher. Here's some ideas. Here's some ways for you to maybe next year throw something different into your classroom to keep it interesting for you, as well as changing it up for your kids. So I think that was not a lesson so much, but that work with those teachers really helped us inform how we approach the book, not to tell teachers how to teach, but just to say, look, here's just some ideas. Here's some new ways of doing things.
That makes perfect sense. Go
Can
ahead,
I
Jennifer.
add to that? I think too, as nationally, as we move towards inquiry, teachers like the idea of it, want to do it, but it's show me what it looks like. I want to do inquiry with my students, but I'm supposed to teach George Washington or Mesopotamia or the French Revolution or whatever it is, and those sometimes very detailed state standards. So I think that was our big aha as we got to brainstorm lessons together to model for teachers. That there was a very much, I can do this. This is manageable. I could try this in one class. And the next part of that, I think they asked was, can you write these down? These things that you have been presenting in professional learning sessions, could you write them so that we can have lots of examples? And honestly, that is the very real way our books got started.
Yeah, and that also allowed us to kind of field test them first, was to go out into classrooms in our local, at the time, in and around Kentucky, in the counties in Kentucky, and take them for a spin and see how they worked or how they didn't, and then modify them.
Well, that's actually a great lead into my next question, because and I'm gonna sort of, I know this is an omnibus kind of question because I'm going to group several things into it, but I don't want to run short on time for audience questions. So thinking about ways you modify these lessons. So one way we might modify them is so that we differentiate the lessons for different types of learners, but also we're all in this situation, and ages too. But we're also in this situation, we're all sheltered in place, and we're doing a lot of online education. Can you guys talk about different ways you might provide these kind of lessons online, about, how would we differentiate them for different types of learners, and just kind of address that as well? Maybe
You want me to
Janet.
start,
I'm
Jen,
gonna throw Janet down.
Either one. Okay.
Take the online and I'll do the other part. How about that?
We have a kind of George and Gracie thing going, or I don't know, Marx Brothers routine that we've honed over 17 years.
Yeah, you take online and I'll take the rest of it. How about that?
All right. Well, I think in some ways these are pretty easily adaptable, because some of those lessons can be done in live chat. if you're doing if you're trying to adapt via Zoom, but a lot of them are, the student goes off and does their own research and their own work. And of course, the environment we find ourselves in is absolutely less than ideal for any kind of teaching, as we would have done 2 months ago. And so what most of what we're trying to do, especially with the teachers I'm working with, is just get by and get as much as we can done. But in terms of these lessons, these essential questions can be assigned, and they can come back, and then they can come back with evidence that they've discovered, with guidelines for how to search online. And the front part of each of the volumes talks about how to find sources online. And so it does require a little bit of breaking the lessons down a little bit more into what can I send out, what needs to go to parents to say they're going to need help with this because there isn't a classroom setting. But because these are discovery-based, students are out looking for these answers on their own. A lot of this can be overnight or over several night types of assignments, and then report back.
That makes sense.
Jenna.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me take the other piece of that, just differentiation in general. So we have written these and targeted them for certain grade levels in the front of the book, but know that they are adaptable for all types of learners. So just in general, a question I get quite a bit is, my students are struggling readers. How do I adapt this for struggling readers? So I would say shorten the sources if needed. And even more important than that, model your thinking and what you do as a reader as you tackle a difficult text. And we've all had difficult text in our years of school at some point in time. What do? Do you reread? Do you circle? Do you highlight? So practice as just general good practice in literacy strategies in your classroom. Do think alouds and model your thinking. Political cartoons are notorious for being really challenging, I think, for students at all levels. So what do you do as a reader and thinker when you first tackle a political cartoon? You look for the title, you look for the date, you look for a cartoonist. So those kind of things that are automatically in our head as readers who've had to read a lot in our careers, do that. Be transparent about that. Show students what you do as a reader and thinker. And then always, and we'll put that in several of our books as suggestions for modifications, adapt those sources as needed, chunk the text. If it's a longer text, use smaller chunks, and then have students stop and talk about it in between the chunks of text. These are wonderful for gifted learners as well. You can always use some of these that are off level for gifted learners. Just recently, a fourth grade teacher, not recently as in 2 months ago before school was out, tried some of the fifth grade US history class lessons in her GT pullout class with some social studies content, but they were gifted readers. So because the text is so complex sometimes with historical documents, her question was, can I use some of these sources if I have GT kids who are gifted at reading? And I said, absolutely, because this develops in them some strategies for complex informational text. And I would say, I told her to let the students help generate more questions. Let them figure out how they're going to present their knowledge and what their product is going to be to answer that question, and give them a lot more flexibility and loosen the reins a bit, and they will run with that with their creative ability. So they very much can be adapted to all different types of learners.
Thank you. I appreciate both of you for that information. I'm going to turn now the webinar over to Stephanie McCauley, one of our education editors here in Austin, Texas. And please go to the Q&A box if you can find it on the interface that you have, and upvote some of these questions and communicate to Stephanie through those upvotes which ones you definitely want her to ask the authors, because we may run out of time. So Stephanie, please take over.
Sure thing. So our first question, how often would you suggest doing inquiry-based lessons?
My initial response is as much as possible. So we all live in a world that's sort of an education world that has standards and assessments, or out of these normal, abnormal conditions we're in. But those skills are critical, not just to learning their history standards, but to reading and thinking and problem solving. So as much as you can do it, I think it would be challenging every day, but as much as you can integrate this type of learning and thinking into units or lessons, you're going to have stronger readers at the end of this.
All right, sounds good. And then also, what are some of your favorite go-tos for primary and secondary sources? Where do you like to go to find those?
So spots are types of sources.
Um, it just says go to, so I think either would be welcome.
So I love maps. They are, we would have had a book full of maps if we hadn't been careful, because I think maps lend themselves to so many kinds of discoveries for students, especially older maps, not road maps, but that's also its own kind of inquiry question, isn't it? What is a map for? And then and I do love the hook, which we've done many times, is you ask students what a map is for, and they write up on the board, you know, to get to grandmother's house or whatever, and all these things. And usually it's to get from point A to point B, because that's how they think of a map. And then we put up on the overhead a map from the 1100s, which has no roads. It doesn't really show anything of, and they have to, well, what is that? That's a map. And so that launches us on our inquiry. And so I think maps are great. There's no one site that I go to for primary sources. I use Google, and I use very specific searches. And the front of all the books talk about how to do this very specifically. But I'll type in something like primary sources in quotes, primary source in quotes, colonial maps, and then go to the images and start scrolling through. Or if I know something specific, Silk Road map, you know, World War II Bataan Death March map, something like that. And so I use the Googles more than I would go to a specific spot for a map.
All right, thank you.
Stephanie,
Mhm.
let me grab here 1 second. I was going to show there. Let me just show the audience a little bit about what Dr. McMichaels is talking about. So in these books, there is always a whole section that really gives you sort of an introduction to using some of the more powerful tools in Google search. And so they give you some very concrete examples of when you're trying to find these primary sources. Here are the kind of searches that you can structure that will lead you to the secondary sources. I thought that was a super helpful part of the book. So thanks, Stephanie. I just wanted to share that.
And
Sure.
I want to share something important from that. The most important lesson about Google is that Google does not, when you search in Google, it does not return the result you want. It returns the result it thinks you want. And so you have to be very specific in what you tell it to get it to narrow things down.
All right. We also got a question about, are there any model videos of inquiry-based learning in practice so they could see that, what it looks like?
There are not very many in social studies, honestly. Inquiry in social studies is relatively new, as in the last several years. The teaching channel has some that are more for their English teachers, but they're using text. So they might be reading a piece of informational text or a story, and the strategy will look the same, and you could just adapt that to your social studies source. There's also a website, c3teachers.org, that is a clearinghouse for teachers across the country who are writing and trying out inquiry lessons in their classroom. And it'll show you examples of the lessons and the sources. I haven't seen videos on it yet, but that's a great site to look at for some samples of teachers who are trying it in their classrooms. And you can search it by grade level, search it by topic, and it includes all the materials for the lessons too, and it's free.
Great. All right. Another question we got was, how is this different from document-based questions? And then a follow-up to that, what's the desired end product? An essay, a debate, a seminar, etc.
I'm going to take that one, Drew.
Sure, at least
so
the
it's
first
very
part.
similar to document-based questions. So in AP classes, they're very familiar with that DBQ, where there's a question and there's a multiple sources, and there are various publishers that produce all types of DBQ types of questions. It's a similar way of thinking. So you have questions and you use your sources to answer the questions. Most of the DBQ assessments are a written essay where you cite the sources. And a lot of times we use that in our books as well, but then also there are times where we would use a debate or students do a project. Like recently, this is a unique example, but a teacher said, I would like the students to use Play-Doh to present what the Powhatan culture was like in the 1600s as the answer to your question instead of having them write. Do you think that would work, Janet? And I said, I think that's brilliant. So each table got 2 jars of Play-Doh, and they had to create a museum exhibit about the Powhatans But the higher level thinking in that was they had to have 4 or 5 different examples of evidence from the clues they had examined to explain why they chose those things in their Play-Doh museum exhibit. So I would say vary that product. Maybe that's how ours is a little bit different, because you have some choices as far as how students answer the question.
And I do think there is a wide variety of ways to do it. And one of my favorite examples, and Jenna saw this, and I repeat this all the time, was a teacher who had a lesson on the effects of coal mining on the environment. And the end of the lesson, she brought in a cake with M&Ms in it, and the kids mined the M&Ms. And then the cake at the end was, of course, destroyed. And that was a tasty lesson, but a very real example of what happens to the surrounding landscape when you mine. And so I thought that was brilliant. It was fifth graders, and it worked really well. So there's all kinds of ways to finish those things up.
All right. We also got a question about inquiry-based lessons and teaching. Sometimes they conflict with the standardized testing and standards, and how can you address both without shortchanging students?
Well, I'm a public school educator, so my answer is always start with your standards first.
Yeah.
It might not be the popular answer, but that's the realistic answer. You are teaching in that environment that has those state standards, and those standards are assessed. So start there before you even develop your questions, and use those standards as a basis for creating some inquiry questions. Whatever it is, the contributions of ancient Egypt, or Napoleon's domestic reforms, whatever that might be, that's the phrase from your standards. Start there and let that question guide your planning. And then no matter what type of inquiry activities or strategies you do, your answer is always aligned with that state standard.
And I think many of the lessons that we have in the books are adaptable to those standards. You start with your standards, see which of the lessons. So each chapter has multiple lessons in it that covers. So the way we structured the book was to get a whole array of social studies textbooks and look at how the chapters were organized and try to align our chapters as best we could with the broadest, with all those textbooks. And so if you go through those chapters, you'll find 2 to 4 lessons in them. And within that, you will probably find something that once you've started with your standards, you can lay those over top of what we've provided and adapt.
All right. Do we have time for any more, or should we?
Yeah, it's
wrap up?
definitely maybe one more. Because
Okay.
I've tried to hold these to 45 minutes
Yeah.
for the audience. So maybe just one more, and then we'll.
We also had a question about moving towards meeting the needs of the gifted child. I know you talked a little bit about that, but do you have anything more to say about gifted learners?
Well, this is a bit of a generalization, but most gifted learners are very creative, very verbal. And so this type of learning is wonderful for them. As much as you can, whether it's a teacher or a parent in a homeschool setting, pique their interest with something, whatever the topic is. It could be a problem, it could be a scenario, something you observe in the yard, something you saw on TV in a news story. Pique their interest and then let them take it. How could we find out more information about this? Where might we look? What kind of sources might we be good? How do we believe those sources? Do we know if they're credible or authentic? Just let the students' learning and the students' interests guide that exploration, and that is powerful for gifted learners.
Yeah, and I was thinking too, one of the things that you guys talked about was the importance of creating an environment for inquiry in the classroom. And your whole model sort of builds to the point where the student, has a hypothesis that they've built the evidence to support, and they can defend that with argument. And it's a great critical thinking tool that I would think works marvelously with gifted children. It's how you could imagine scaffolding in different ways so that some kids are working with you could even be working with the same topic in the classroom. It's just different materials and different evidence that are built out to those broader conclusions that maybe the gifted kids are able to reach. Well, listen, let me butt in here and tell everyone that Jenna Kutchner now does consulting out in the school. So if you guys have any want to visit her website, email her. She's also on Twitter. She's happy to take questions and consult. So feel free to contact Dr. Kuchner, and if I will provide this also in a follow-up email, but I did want to provide that to you guys here at the end of the session. Dr. Kuchner, thank you so much for being here. I sure appreciate it. And Dr. McMichaels, thank you to both for being here. This has been wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Having us.
Thanks, and thanks to the audience. I mean, and you guys stay
Yeah.
safe and healthy. And thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.